In the spring of 1968, an American colonel standing at the entrance of a forward operating base in Phuoc Thi province counted the New Zealand patrol preparing for jungle insertion and made a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He counted them 3 times. He got the same number each time, 31 men. 31 soldiers from a country with a population smaller than some American cities, equipped with weapons that looked like they had been assembled from spare parts, wearing configurations so stripped down and irregular that 2 of his staff officers initially mistook them for local irregulars. The colonel turned to his intelligence officer and said 4 words that would become infamous in Anzac military circles for decades. "Look at those amateurs." He was not being unkind. He was being accurate by every metric the American military used to measure fighting capability. 31 men with modified equipment from a nation of fewer than 3 million people had no business operating in a war theater this complex, this brutal, this sophisticated. By every calculation the American military establishment relied upon, the New Zealanders were not a military asset. They were a liability. They were window dressing, diplomatic theater, a Commonwealth obligation that produced nothing but paperwork. The colonel would spend the next 18 months revising that assessment, one humiliation at a time. What happened in the jungles of Phuoc Thi province between 1968 and 1971 was not supposed to be possible. A force so small it could fit inside a single American platoon, operating without the technological infrastructure that U.S. military doctrine considered the absolute minimum for sustained combat effectiveness, achieved results that classified Pentagon assessments would later describe as statistically improbable. The numbers were real. The operations were documented. The after-action reports existed in filing cabinets that senior American commanders preferred not to open, because the numbers inside those reports raised questions that American doctrine could not answer without dismantling assumptions that had governed U.S. military thinking for 2 decades. 31 men, results that should have required 300. The colonel's 4 words would follow him out of Vietnam and into the rest of his life. Look at those amateurs. He had never been more wrong about anything. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what the New Zealand contingent was, where it came from, and what it carried into that jungle that no American officer could see by looking at equipment and headcount. The New Zealand Special Air Service had been forged in a crucible that most Western military establishments had never encountered. Before Vietnam, before anyone in Washington had fully committed to Southeast Asia, the SAS had spent years conducting some of the most demanding and classified jungle operations of the post-war era in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, a conflict so deliberately obscured by British and Commonwealth authorities that most Americans were barely aware it had happened at all. In the dense primary jungle of Borneo, against Indonesian regular army units that were significantly better equipped and trained than the Viet Cong, New Zealand soldiers had developed a methodology that bore almost no resemblance to anything in the American field manual. They had not developed it in a training facility or on a theoretical basis. They had developed it by surviving situations that should have killed them, and by learning from every near-death experience with a ruthlessness of self-examination that institutional military culture almost never permits. But the Borneo experience was only part of what the New Zealanders carried. The other part was something the American colonel could not have seen even if he had known to look for it, because it existed not in equipment or doctrine, but in the cultural inheritance of a significant portion of the men standing before him. Among those 31 soldiers were men whose grandfathers had been warriors in the most literal sense of the word, whose family histories were inseparable from the history of warfare. whose relationship with landscape, terrain, and the natural world had been shaped by traditions of tracking, concealment, and environmental reading that stretched back centuries before the first European ship had ever sailed within sight of New Zealand's coastline. The Maori soldiers in that contingent did not arrive with these abilities fully formed. Military training does not work that way. But they arrived with a relationship to the natural world, to patience, to reading environment as a language. That their training could develop in ways it could not replicate from scratch in men who had grown up in suburban American cities. The colonel saw 31 men with unconventional equipment. He did not see what those 31 men were made of, where they came from, or what they understood about the environment they were about to enter. The first thing that disturbed American observers about the New Zealand approach was the same thing that had disturbed them about the Australians operating in the same province: the smell. Or more precisely, the deliberate and systematic elimination of the wrong kind of smell. American military hygiene doctrine in Vietnam was comprehensive, standardized, and lethal. Soap, deodorant, shaving cream, insect repellent, the distinctive sweet tobacco of American cigarettes. All of it created a chemical signature in the humid air of Southeast Asian jungle that dissipated over hours rather than minutes. Captured documents recovered from Viet Cong intelligence units confirmed what Australian and New Zealand personnel had understood from the beginning of their deployment. Enemy scouts could detect American patrol presence from distances exceeding 400 meters in certain atmospheric conditions. The jungle air held chemical compounds the way still water holds a dye. An American patrol that had moved through an area hours before could still be detected by its residual scent profile. The Viet Cong had built tactical doctrine around this single fact. They positioned listening posts downwind of likely patrol routes. They trained scouts specifically in the identification of Western chemical signatures. What smelled like discipline and professionalism to an American sergeant inspecting his clean-shaved men before insertion smelled like a targeting solution to every experienced enemy tracker within half a kilometer of the patrol's route. The New Zealanders had eliminated this problem with a thoroughness that American hygiene officers found both personally offensive and professionally inexplicable. 3 weeks before any patrol insertion, SAS troopers ceased using every commercial hygiene product completely. No soap, no deodorant, no shaving cream, no insect repellent containing Western chemical compounds. They switched to local tobacco varieties or stopped smoking entirely. They altered their diet progressively toward local food sources, including fermented fish preparations that changed body chemistry in ways that eliminated the residual markers a Western diet created in perspiration. By the time a New Zealand patrol was ready for insertion, the men smelled like the jungle itself, like decomposing leaf matter, damp earth, and the particular biological signature of a wet tropical environment. American personnel who came near them during this preparation period reacted with undisguised disgust. The New Zealanders accepted this reaction as confirmation they were ready. An American who found them offensive to stand next to was detecting exactly what they needed the jungle to find unremarkable. The smell was not failure of discipline. It was the highest expression of it. But the smell elimination was merely the visible surface of a methodology that went considerably deeper. The weapons the New Zealanders carried into the jungle had been modified in ways that ordnance officers repeatedly tried to condemn and document, and which the New Zealanders repeatedly ignored. Standard issue weapons had been shortened, adapted, stripped of components that added weight and length without contributing to effectiveness in the specific environment where they would actually be used. American weapons specialists who examined SAS equipment described the modifications with language that ranged from concerned to professionally appalled. They had reduced effective range. They had altered ballistics. They had created weapons that violated multiple provisions of standard operating procedure. What those specialists had failed to account for was that in the Vietnamese jungle, with average visibility between 10 and 20 meters, a weapon accurate to 400 meters was not a precision tool. It was a liability. Every centimeter of additional barrel length was a centimeter that could snag on bamboo, on undergrowth, on the hanging root systems that turned jungle movement into a continuous negotiation with dense vegetation. Every snag required stopping. Every stop created sound. Every sound could mean detection. The New Zealanders had optimized their weapons for the actual environment, rather than the theoretical one that doctrine assumed. The resulting equipment looked catastrophically wrong to every American who examined it. It worked perfectly in the only context that mattered. The footwear was the modification that produced the most visceral American reaction. Several members of the New Zealand contingent wore sandals into the jungle. Not military footwear of any recognized pattern, not specialist jungle boots developed by Commonwealth forces, but sandals constructed from vehicle tire rubber, with straps cut from inner tube material. They were unmistakably the footwear of the Viet Cong, manufactured in exactly the same way, using exactly the same materials, leaving exactly the same track pattern in soft earth that enemy forces left everywhere they moved. This was not coincidence or improvisation born of desperation. It was deliberate and psychologically sophisticated deception. A Viet Cong tracker following a trail of these prints would not raise an alarm. He would not call for ambush teams. He might follow the trail toward what he assumed was a friendly unit moving through his operational area. He might walk directly into the New Zealand patrol, believing he was approaching comrades. The tactical and psychological consequences of this one modification were enormous, and they cost nothing to implement. American jungle boots had specific tread patterns recognizable to any trained tracker. Every American patrol left impressions that an experienced observer could identify, count, time, and follow with accuracy. The New Zealanders had erased this signature entirely by adopting the enemy's own footwear, turning a tracking advantage into a tracking trap. The movement doctrine was where American observers finally ran out of professional patience. United States Special Operations Forces conducting long-range reconnaissance in Vietnam moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day. This was considered cautious, methodical, and operationally sound. It represented the American military's best thinking on balancing mission completion speed against detection risk. The New Zealand SAS moved at 100 to 150 meters per hour on approach to sensitive objectives. When American liaison officers first encountered this figure in operational planning documents, several requested clarification, assuming a transcription error. 150 meters per hour meant that a 5-kilometer approach to an objective required more than 30 hours of movement. It meant a patrol could operate for weeks and cover distances that an American unit would cover in days. It seemed to negate the entire purpose of insertion, to be a methodology so slow it defeated itself before it began. What those liaison officers had not seen was a New Zealand patrol actually moving. When American officers were permitted to observe training exercises, their reactions followed a pattern documented in multiple after-action reports. Initial dismissal, growing confusion, eventual silence, 4 men entering dense jungle vegetation and becoming, for all practical purposes, invisible and inaudible within seconds. The movement was not walking in any conventional sense. Each step was placed with a precision that turned locomotion into a series of individual decisions. each one preceded by a period of complete stillness lasting between 3 and 5 minutes. During those stillness periods, the troopers did not merely wait. They processed. They read the jungle soundscape for any change that indicated their passage had been detected. They tested air movement with nostril movements so subtle they were invisible from 5 meters. They scanned their entire visible environment using only eye movement, never turning their heads in ways that might catch the peripheral vision of an enemy observer. They adjusted their grip on their weapons in preparation for instant response while appearing completely inert. When the next step came, it came with a placement so deliberate that the jungle soundscape did not change. Birds kept singing. Insects maintained their continuous drone. The canopy above continued its movements. The jungle registered no intrusion because the New Zealanders had learned to move in a way that the jungle did not recognize as movement. The tactical consequences of this methodology were documented in classified reports that American commands found deeply uncomfortable. New Zealand patrols operating at this speed detected enemy activity that faster-moving American units walked past without registering. A patrol that had been stationary for 4 hours in a concealed position processed sound information that a moving patrol generated too much internal noise to hear. Viet Cong units moving at normal speed through areas where New Zealand patrols were operating created exactly the sound signatures that the troopers had trained for weeks to recognize. The hunters found themselves hunted by men they could neither smell, hear, nor track, who could detect them from distances that violated the assumptions underlying their entire tactical doctrine. Among the New Zealand contingent, this capacity for environmental reading reached its highest expression in the Maori soldiers. And it reached that point because it built on something that military training alone cannot create. The Maori people had inhabited New Zealand's diverse and demanding environments for centuries before European contact, developing in that time a body of knowledge about landscape, animal behavior, plant patterns, and environmental reading that represented a continuous tradition of practical wilderness intelligence. This was not mystical knowledge. It was accumulated practical expertise, refined through generations of people who needed to read their environment accurately to survive, and who passed that knowledge forward through demonstration and oral tradition, through the kind of teaching that happens when the cost of not learning is measured in lives. A Maori soldier who had grown up in a family that maintained these traditions arrived at military training with an existing capacity for environmental awareness that his instructors could develop but could not install from scratch. He knew what a landscape looked like when it had been recently disturbed by human movement. He understood the relationship between bird behavior and human presence at a level of specificity that took soldiers without this background years of discipline training to approximate. He could read the difference between a forest at rest and a forest that had been disrupted, not from any supernatural perception, but from a pattern recognition capacity built across a lifetime of deliberate attention to exactly these distinctions. The New Zealand approach to the enemy mirrored the Australian attitude in its most tactically significant dimension. They did not underestimate the Viet Cong. They had read the same intelligence reports American commanders read. They had spoken to the same captured enemy fighters. They understood that they were operating against opponents who had been conducting warfare in this specific terrain, against opponents using this specific doctrine for decades. The Viet Cong were not primitive irregulars improvising resistance against a technologically superior opponent. They were experienced soldiers operating in their home environment, using methods refined through years of continuous combat against French forces, South Vietnamese forces, and American forces. methods that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of their own capabilities and their opponent's limitations. NZSAS briefings referred to enemy capabilities with an attention to detail that American liaison officers sometimes mistook for defeatism. It was not defeatism. It was professional respect for a dangerous and competent opponent, and that respect expressed itself in preparation that American doctrine consistently failed to match. The American colonel, who had dismissed the New Zealand contingent as amateurs, began revising his assessment in the third month of their operational deployment. When intelligence reports from their area of operations started producing information of a quality and specificity that his own units were not generating, enemy positions documented with precision that suggested the reporting patrol had been within close observation range for extended periods. Troop strength estimates that proved accurate when subsequent operations confirmed them. Movement pattern analysis that allowed American planners to predict enemy dispositions 24 hours in advance with a reliability that was, in the colonel's private assessment, unsettling. He had been receiving intelligence from a 31-man unit that was outperforming his battalion-level reconnaissance assets. He did not publicize this discrepancy. He used the intelligence. He filed the reports. He did not connect the results to the methodology that produced them, because connecting them would have required acknowledging that his opening assessment had been wrong in a way that reflected poorly on the assumptions underlying American doctrine, rather than on the specific failures of specific individuals. The moment that forced acknowledgement came in the 9th month of the New Zealand deployment, and it came in a form that could not be classified, suppressed, or quietly filed away. An American infantry company operating in adjacent sector conducted an air assault insertion into an area where New Zealand intelligence had identified significant enemy concentration. The intelligence was accurate. The enemy was there. The enemy had been there for weeks in prepared positions with defensive arrangements that reflected extended occupation and careful planning. The difference between what New Zealand methodology would have produced entering that area and what American doctrine produced was measured, as these differences always were. In the first minutes of contact, the Viet Cong heard the insertion helicopters from kilometers away. They heard the company assembling after landing. They heard the patrol formation beginning movement through terrain that to American ears sounded like normal jungle, and to enemy listening posts sounded like a company of men walking through dry leaves in a quiet room. The ambush was waiting. The company walked into it because every assumption underlying their movement discipline told them they were operating with adequate caution. 19 Americans fell in the initial contact. 41 were wounded in the engagement that followed. The artillery support arrived on schedule and performed exactly as doctrine specified, and accomplished almost nothing against prepared positions that enemy fighters had spent weeks constructing to survive American artillery support. The helicopter gunships arrived and expended ordnance against targets that American ground observers could identify only as approximate locations behind jungle canopy that concealed everything meaningful about the enemy's actual disposition. The company commander, a capable officer by every conventional measure, found himself in the position American commanders consistently found themselves in when doctrine met the Vietnamese jungle. He had significant firepower. He could not effectively direct it because he could not see his enemy. His enemy could see him perfectly. At 14:23 hours, with his company holding a defensive perimeter and taking casualties at a rate his ammunition reserves could not sustain for more than another 40 minutes. The company commander made a radio call that was heard by the New Zealand patrol, operating 1,100 meters to his north. The New Zealanders had been in position for 19 hours. They had not moved, had not eaten a hot meal, had not made any sound registerable by the enemy listening posts that the Viet Cong maintained throughout this sector. They had spent 19 hours becoming part of the jungle, listening to it, reading it, processing information from it that no moving patrol could have gathered. They knew where the enemy battalion command post was located. They knew where the machine gun positions were that were producing the majority of American casualties. They knew the withdrawal routes the enemy would use when the battle turned against them. Because they had watched those routes being prepared and had mapped them with the patience that only 19 hours of absolute stillness makes possible. The New Zealand patrol commander received the American radio call and made his decision without hesitation and without consultation with higher command. Allied soldiers were dying within hearing range. The question of doctrine was irrelevant. The question of method was not. He would move his patrol toward the contact, and he would do it the New Zealand way, at the pace, and in the manner that made what happened next possible. The American company commander, receiving word that New Zealand reinforcement was approaching, asked for an estimated time of arrival. The answer he received produced a response that his radio operator would later describe as language entirely unsuitable for official record. The New Zealanders would arrive when they arrived. They would arrive having accomplished something that no faster movement would have permitted. The company commander did not understand this. He demanded speed. The New Zealand patrol commander declined to provide it. He provided something more valuable instead. What the Americans could not see during those 91 minutes of waiting was what the New Zealand patrol was actually doing. They were not moving toward the American position. They were moving into the enemy position, through it, using the noise of the firefight as auditory cover that masked their own movement, using their scent discipline to pass undetected through positions where enemy fighters were focused entirely on the American perimeter to their front. 4 New Zealand soldiers were navigating through a battalion-sized enemy formation without triggering a single alert. They passed within meters of fighters who were actively engaged in a firefight. They moved through a rear area that the enemy considered secure because no Western patrol had ever penetrated it without generating the noise signatures that enemy listening posts were specifically positioned to detect. The New Zealanders generated none of those signatures. They moved like the jungle moved, slowly, without urgency, without the behavioral signals that human presence creates in people who are thinking about tomorrow or yesterday, or anything other than the precise sensory reality of the present moment. At 54 hours, the New Zealand patrol reached a position that the American company commander, when he was later shown on a map exactly where it was, refused initially to accept as real. They were inside the enemy perimeter. They were 30 meters from the battalion command post. They were surrounded by over 200 enemy fighters who had no idea they were there. From this position, the patrol commander began transmitting artillery corrections. These were not the broad area adjustments that had been failing to affect enemy positions for 90 minutes. These were precision coordinates specifying individual targets with accuracy that the artillery battery commander on the receiving end initially questioned. Because no forward observer conducting adjustments from outside the enemy perimeter could have seen what these coordinates specified with this level of detail. The first corrected mission landed directly on the command post. The second eliminated the machine gun position responsible for approximately half the American casualties. The third sealed the primary withdrawal route. The fourth destroyed an ammunition cache, whose secondary explosions continued for several minutes, and announced to every enemy fighter in the area that something had gone catastrophically wrong in their rear area. Within 22 minutes, A battle that had been systematically dismantling an American infantry company reversed completely. Enemy positions that had been invisible to American ground observers and resistant to area fire were being destroyed with an accuracy that seemed, to the Viet Cong fighters experiencing it, to suggest that the Americans had somehow achieved observation from inside their own lines. The command structure that had been directing the engagement ceased to exist in the first corrected artillery mission. Without command, coordinated fighting positions became individual decisions. Without coordination, the prepared withdrawal plan collapsed. Without the ammunition cache, sustained resistance became impossible. The survivors broke and moved, and several of them moved toward withdrawal routes that had already been identified, mapped, and sealed. The battle ended not with an American triumph of firepower, but with a New Zealand application of intelligence gathered through patience. Delivered from a position of such audacity that the after-action report would be read by 3 separate American generals, who each independently asked the reporting officer whether the coordinates in the document were accurate. They were accurate. The New Zealand patrol that had infiltrated an enemy battalion called precision fires from inside the perimeter and reversed the outcome of a battle that was 20 minutes from producing a catastrophic American defeat, suffered 0 casualties. The American company they had saved suffered 19 killed and 41 wounded from an initial force of 112. The after-action report was classified at a level that ensured it would not circulate broadly, and the classification decision had less to do with operational security than with institutional discomfort. 31 amateurs had demonstrated something that the American military establishment was not prepared to document openly. The colonel who had made his assessment at the entrance to the forward operating base 9 months earlier read the report twice, alone in his office, and did not discuss its contents with his staff. The captured documents that surfaced in the following months provided the external validation that no American report could supply with equal credibility. Viet Cong tactical guidance dealing specifically with New Zealand forces had been in distribution among enemy units operating in Phuoc Thi province for over a year before American intelligence fully processed its implications. The guidance was remarkable not for its tactical content, but for its tone. Documents dealing with American forces described vulnerabilities with clinical confidence. American units could be smelled at distance. Their movement could be heard and predicted. Their insertion patterns were consistent and exploitable. Their doctrine favored escalating firepower responses that created predictable timelines, allowing enemy withdrawal before effective retaliation arrived. For American forces, the guidance recommended aggressive ambush, maximum casualties in minimum time, prepared withdrawal through routes American firepower could not effectively cover. For the New Zealanders, the guidance was fundamentally different in character. It was written in the tone of a force describing an opponent it had not found reliable methods to counter. New Zealand patrols could not be reliably detected by smell. They could not be heard because their movement speed produced no sound signature that enemy listening posts were trained to recognize. Their tracks were indistinguishable from Viet Cong movement when they used local footwear, and their counter-tracking measures made trail following an exercise that produced no useful intelligence. Their patience exceeded anything the guidance writers had observed in other Western forces operating in this theater. They had remained in observation positions for periods of time that enemy tactical planning had never accounted for as operational possibilities. The recommended approach for engaging New Zealand forces occupied a single paragraph. It recommended avoidance. If contact was unavoidable, it recommended breaking contact as quickly as possible and withdrawing to areas where New Zealand patrols were not operating. It recommended against pursuit. It noted that New Zealand counterattacking capability made pursuit attempts more dangerous to the pursuing force than withdrawal. And it used a term for New Zealand soldiers that would be confirmed by multiple subsequent captured documents and by Viet Cong veterans interviewed decades after the war's end. 5 jungle devils. Not because there were always 5 of them, though patrols were often that size, but because the number had taken on totemic significance in enemy, oral accounts of engagements that the survivors could not fully explain. They had been there, and then they had not been there. They had been inside positions that should have been impenetrable. They had known things that required observation that should have been impossible. 5 jungle devils. The designation carried its own weight in the cultural framework of the people who assigned it, and it was applied to no other Allied force operating in that province. American commanders who reviewed these documents in 1969 faced a choice that institutional culture made almost impossible to make correctly. The evidence in their hands indicated that a 31-man Commonwealth contingent had developed and was executing a form of warfare that American doctrine not only did not practice but actively discouraged, and that this form of warfare was producing results that American methods were not producing in adjacent sectors conducting similar missions. The rational response to this evidence was adoption. The institutional response was to note the documents for the record, to continue existing operations in existing configurations, and to attribute the New Zealand results to favorable terrain. Fortuitous timing, and the small sample size that made statistical comparison unreliable. The last point was technically defensible. You cannot draw broad conclusions from 31 men in one sector. This was true. It was also the institutional equivalent of declining to learn how to navigate because your sample of navigators was insufficiently large. Individual American officers who sought out New Zealand personnel and asked questions received answers that were given freely and without condescension. The New Zealanders did not guard their methods. They taught anyone who asked with patience and specificity. The smell elimination protocol could be explained in 20 minutes. The movement discipline could be demonstrated in an afternoon. The weapons modifications could be replicated by any qualified armorer. None of these things required access to classified programs or specialized equipment unavailable to American forces. They required a willingness to accept that existing methods were producing unnecessary casualties, and that different methods were available, proven, and teachable. Several American officers who received this instruction attempted to introduce elements of it into their own unit's operations. The results they achieved were documented. The documentation was filed alongside similar documentation from officers who had made similar attempts in previous years and faced similar institutional responses. The filing system was efficient. The learning was not. What the statistics never captured, and what the classified reports were not designed to contain, was the cost that these methods extracted from the men who practiced them. Becoming invisible in the jungle was not a technique that could be applied and removed like equipment. It was a transformation. And transformations of that depth left marks that did not reverse when the mission ended. The SAS troopers who returned from extended patrols had spent weeks in a state of sensory alertness that civilian neuroscience would later struggle to categorize. They had suppressed every internal process that could generate behavioral signals, because behavioral signals could be detected, and detection could mean death for the entire patrol. The human mind is not naturally quiet. It generates constant internal activity, planning, worrying, remembering, anticipating, the continuous cognitive noise that most people never notice because it is so consistent it becomes invisible. The New Zealanders learned to silence this noise completely, not to manage it or redirect it, but to eliminate it entirely. To exist for hours and then for days, in a state of pure environmental awareness that had no room for anything that was not immediately present in the sensory world around them. This state was operationally invaluable. It made them invisible in ways that physical concealment alone could not achieve. An enemy scout looking at a concealed position where a New Zealand trooper had achieved this state would see nothing unusual, not because the physical concealment was perfect, but because the trooper was generating no behavioral indicators for the scout's perception to register. The stillness was total in a way that went beyond physical immobility, but this state did not end when the patrol ended. Veterans reported experiences in the years and decades after their service that the available clinical frameworks for combat trauma did not adequately describe. Not an inability to function, in many cases, but an inability to return completely to the world that existed before they had entered the jungle. Hypervigilance that persisted for years without diminishing. A relationship with crowds, with urban environments, with the noise of ordinary civilian life that never normalized in the way that military readjustment programs assumed it would. Some men found that the jungle state had become their default, and that everything else required effort that did not come naturally anymore. They had learned to become part of the environment so completely that no subsequent environment ever felt as real as the one where that skill had been necessary for survival. The Maori soldiers faced additional complexity in this readjustment. They returned to communities that had maintained connections to the traditions their military training had built upon. But they returned changed in ways that those traditions had not prepared their families to receive. The knowledge they had carried into the jungle had been transformed by the context in which they had used it. Tracking, environmental awareness, patience, the reading of landscape as information, these were not new concepts in their cultural inheritance. They were ancient ones. But using them in the context they had been used in, for the purposes they had served, had altered something in the relationship between the men and the knowledge that could not be easily explained to people who had not been there. Some came home and found that the traditions they had carried into the jungle felt different in their hands when they returned. The weight had changed. What had been passed down through generations as knowledge of how to live in relationship with the land had been used, for 3 years, as knowledge of how to kill within it. That was not the same thing, and some men spent the rest of their lives working out the difference. The colonel who had said, "Look at those amateurs," left Vietnam in 1970. He did not leave having adopted New Zealand methodology. He left having used New Zealand intelligence, having benefited from New Zealand capabilities, having received credit in operational summaries for actions that New Zealand soldiers had enabled, and having never publicly revised the assumptions that his opening assessment expressed. This was not personal failing, it was institutional faithfulness. The institution he served had built its doctrine on assumptions that New Zealand performance challenged directly. And the institution was not prepared to make the adjustments that honest engagement with that challenge would have required. The colonel did what institutional culture trains its members to do with uncomfortable evidence. He used what was useful, filed what was inconvenient, and maintained the framework that his career had been built on validating. He was not unusual in this. He was representative.